What does it mean to create safe and courageous spaces in school? What does it have to do with self-awareness, and how can we use the creative arts to process big emotions? Well, today I am talking with Sharon Costianes, and we address some of these very questions. We talk about how high achievers can lean on perfectionism and pressure, and leads us away from the part of us that can be creative and artistic. But leaning into learning, into the mess and the mistakes, provides an opportunity to create a sense of safety within these intellectual spaces. When we are truly embodied in mind, body, and spirit, it is how we can perform and achieve as our best selves. And throughout her life experiences, she discovered a pathway for her own healing and continues to light the way for others. And if you are ready to move from surviving to thriving, head on over to empowerededucator.com/thrive and sign up for the 5-week online course that will change the game for how you show up at work and at home. Start to feel less stress and more ease, less pressure, more calm, less frustration, and of course, more joy. It is time for you to thrive. So head on over to empowerededucator.com/thrive. And I also want to mention that in this conversation, we briefly talk about some sensitive topics, including domestic abuse and suicide. Please take care of yourselves. Remember all the passion and vision you had when you first went into teaching? Feeling like building young minds and creating community through your work would make a lasting impact on this world? Well, those days may feel like they're behind you now because you're exhausted, stressed, and overwhelmed and frustrated. But I'm here to tell you it doesn't have to be like this. In fact, the love of teaching never really went away, but it absolutely needs transformation. Welcome to the Take Notes podcast. I'm Jen Rafferty, former music teacher, mom of 2, and certified emotional intelligence practitioner, and I'm here to light the way for you. In order to create a generational change for our kids, we need to shift the paradigm away from the perpetual stress and overwhelm and into a life of joy and fulfillment. This is Education 2.0, where you become the priority, shift how you live your life, and how you show up both at work and at home. So take a sip of steamy morning coffee and grab your notebook. It's time to take notes. Hello, and welcome back to Take Notes. I am so excited to start this next episode and introduce you to a spectacular human. This is Sharon Costianes, and she has a Bachelor of Music from Ithaca College, where I also went to college, in vocal performance and sociology with a minor in theater and a certification from Feldenkrais Resources in Manhattan, as well as a professional certification from the Feldenkrais Guild of North America. And we're going to dive into all about Feldenkrais and what that means and how cool it is and how helpful it will be for your overall well-being. Sharon has studied extensively and volunteers at the clinic with Cheryl Field at the Field Center for Children's Integrated Development, and is also the founder and director of Flight Performing Arts in Ithaca, New York. Sharon has helped introduce freedom and mobility to people with chronic pain or arthritis, as well as people recovering from injury, trauma, and surgery through her Feldenkrais practice at Body Song, and has worked with a wide variety of people, performers, athletes, elders, children, and today, educators. And as a graduate of Heartstone Herbal School, a cookbook is currently in the works, which I'm so excited to hear about that too. And as part of all of the things that she does do, we're going to talk especially today about how we can engage in self-care, develop our own sense of self-awareness, and leverage our own wellness to create safe and brave spaces for learning that support equity and inclusion in all of our places and spaces. So thank you so much, Sharon, for being here with me today.
Thanks for having me, Jen. I'm so excited for this conversation and so excited for the work that you do.
Thank you. Yes. And just let you know, I'm reading your bio, and isn't it just cool just to sit back and listen and be like, yeah, that's me.
It's true.
Right? I mean, you are a powerhouse, and I am so excited to dive into some of these things. You can share your expertise with me and obviously everyone listening. So I'd love to start with your journey into self-awareness. I too have been on this journey of my own self-awareness for many years, and everyone kind of gets there differently and at different times in their life. So what was it like for you, and how has that really inspired the work that you do now?
That's a great question. Thank you. I mean, I feel like my journey of self-awareness starts a long, long, long time ago when I was a teenager, actually. My home life wasn't great. I grew up in an abusive home. It's something that I don't talk about much. I'm just starting to talk about a little bit more and recognize for myself how connected it is to the arts for me as a person, and also the importance of safe space in the arts for kids as an educator. So growing up in an abusive home, I remember hiding under a blanket with my sister on the stairs, listening to my parents fight. At some point, my mom and my sister and I fled, and nobody knew. I was one of those kids who was like in the gifted and talented programs and participating in every single music ensemble. I played the trumpet and the French horn and sang in the choir and in the select choir and was the president of the drama club. Like, I was outwardly this super high functioning kid with great grades who was involved in a whole lot of extracurriculars. And meanwhile, I was in a ton of pain. I was suicidal. I was self-harming. And the arts was the place that was safe for me. In theater, I could explore a literally scripted version of how people work out issues, right? It was so comforting to know that there was a beginning, middle, and end, and I didn't have to figure it out for myself. The playwright had already figured that out, and I could have big feelings on stage. It was incredibly therapeutic. And similarly with music, it was more about emotions and less intellectual storytelling, I think, as music is. It was my escape. It was how I didn't have to be home because I was involved in all of these other things. So I didn't have to face the pain at home. And so that kind of led me, that's why I started therapy. But luckily my parents knew enough to get me talking with somebody to help me stay alive. And so that was kind of the beginning of self-awareness and a deep connection to the arts for me. I then went to study music at Ithaca College and studied with Carol McAmis, who's also a Feldenkrais practitioner and an amazing...
Love Carol. Yes, Carol done here eventually too.
Yeah, good. Yeah, she's a magical human. And so I started doing Feldenkrais work and knew that it's making me a better singer. Great. And it can be really transformative for singers. And it was for me, but it wasn't actually until I graduated from college. And I was like any good musician with a music degree and performance, I was working as a barista and waiting tables.
And that's kind of the gig, right?
Yeah. I'm a musician. I'm going to go work in service. That's what we do. So I threw my back out, and I had a history of chronic back pain. It was like before people were still on their parents' insurance until 21 or 5 or whatever it is. So I had no health insurance. I had no means of making money. I couldn't walk for a week. And I panicked and called Carol and said, is there anything I can do at home? Tell me some movement that I can do. Help me out. She said, just have somebody throw you in the car and bring you down here. And so I hobbled into her house. I could barely move any of the joints in my low back. And I spent about a half an hour on her Feldenkrais table and walked out of her house. And I went, whoa, wow, this is way more than just I'm a better singer. Something just happened to me that was pretty transformative. And I wasn't completely pain-free. That took a lot more work, but it was a huge moment for me. And it totally changed the trajectory of what I thought my life was going to look like as a 21-year-old. So I went to study Feldenkrais work over the course of those 4 years. I mean, it's all self-awareness. And it's the beautiful thing about Feldenkrais is that while it's a movement practice and it looks like body work, it's really about neurology and how it is that we learn to be in ourselves. So you can't work on movement issues without working on all of your issues. It's it's all in there.
I'm so glad you said that, because that is the opposite of what I usually say in regards to you can't do mindset work without involving your body. And here you are saying you cannot do body work without involving your mind. And I just really want to highlight this. We so often forget we have a body. We forget we have bodies unless they're in pain or with disease or illness, and then we're angry about it. But any sort of work that we're doing with the mind or the body has to be both. I'm so glad that you said that.
Absolutely. And I think that as educators too, we have to create spaces in which our students can work intellectually, but also that their bodies feel safe. But if their bodies don't feel safe, they can't do the learning, and vice versa. So it's huge. Yeah. So when I went into my Feldenkrais training, I had chronic back pain. I was severely overweight. I was also married to a man. I got married right out of college to my high school best friend, who is a dear human and I adore to this day. But in the course of these 4 years, I lost 80 pounds, discovered that I'm gay, got divorced, and healed my back pain. And so it was this like all of life just shifted. Still in therapy, my mental health was much better. And I have to say that level of awareness, that self-awareness, and taking the time to be embodied, because I had to, because for my education, it changed everything about the way I think about music, everything about the way I think about teaching, how I think about interacting with other people. And it's the lens that I have looked through as a teacher for the past 20 years. It's the lens that I look through as I created Flight Performing Arts and really expanding into all of the performing arts and supporting an environment for kids to be expressive.
So much of that, I can go so many different places with it because there's so much juiciness. First of all, thank you for sharing your story, because again, I think we were talking about even before we started recording is that the more we share, that's where the connections happen. And so I received that, and I'm grateful that you shared here and with everyone, and how beautifully important that is, even to just set an example of that being okay for other people to share.
Thank you.
Yes, that's huge. And then taking that pain and turning it into something beautiful and discovering a pathway where you can not just heal yourself, but allow people to come to their own healing. That's huge. So Flight Performing Arts, can you talk a little bit about that and how you're able to do that through the vehicle of arts?
Flight Performing Arts, my voice students, I'm primarily a voice teacher. I had voice students who were pre-professional musical theater singers and doing really high level work and auditioning for programs that have a 2 and 3% acceptance rate. And getting in, I'm happy to say, I'm proud to say, they did the work, they did it, but it's intense. And they didn't have ways to work in dance that supported them also being on stage and doing shows. They didn't have acting training. They just had voice lessons with me. And so I went, oh, they need this. So we created Flight Performing Arts in 2017. And it's a space where kids and adults can take dance class and acting classes and summer camps and voice lessons. Pre-pandemic times had master classes, special workshops, and wellness classes. And the idea is that it's a safe space. Equity and inclusion is super important. Just training staff to be responsive and inclusive is super important at Flight. And we're doing pre-professional work and really challenging and trusting kids with hard work in the performing arts. And at the same time, saying to them, this is an environment where you can take risks. This is an environment where you can be brave. And we're going to find this high level of performance, but without perfectionism, without this like drive of the teacher is always the expert. We know a lot of things and we can share a lot of things as teachers. And we also can learn a lot of things from our students. That's a huge part of Flight. And so there's the teaching and the technique, and that is this high level of work. And then there is this environmental piece, which is very intentional and creates learning in a way that I think is in some ways unique to the arts and also sometimes elusive for us in the arts, because there is this history and this tradition of performing to a high standard, like that perfectionism of you have to practice, and it has to be perfect in order to be relevant, in order to be competitive, in order to get into that 2 or 3% acceptance rate school. The pressure of that level of performance can let us forget what it actually means to be creative. And we can override the parts of ourselves that we need to trust and have faith in and make space for in the creative space. So then we find ourselves really technically perfect, but not with a lot of artistry, right? And we actually need both. So if we can get rid of the perfectionism, if we can create safe space where mistakes are good, mistakes, we learn from them and we celebrate them. Sometimes we do the mistake on purpose, actually, so that we can learn from it in a way that detaches it from self-worth, right? You're still a good human, even though you made a mistake. You're still loved. You're still wanted. You're still valued here. And then we'll just get curious about it. We'll play with it. And then ultimately, we're going to discover something that helps us get to that high level of artistry that we never would have known was possible if we just ran away from the mistake from the beginning.
Girl, I am like welling up here because it's true. You're hitting on so many things that I hold dear. And if we just took out the word art for a second and use just general education, this is it. You're describing my dream for the future of education, because when we say the words, mistakes are okay, but when we define success in the classroom as to how many hundreds or A's that you get, there is a disconnect.
Yes.
So not only are we creating places of pressure and perfectionism, we either have learners that can achieve without heart, or we turn kids off completely to their own learning. We're not actually getting to the meat of it, which is, again, like you said, trusting yourself, trusting the process, creating a space to have kids discover a means to their own learning. And you use the word artistry there, but I'm going to say learning. And here's the rub. It's us. It's the educators who are doing this. And it's not your fault. And that's the thing. It's not our fault, because we are products of our own experience that were taught to us, and this is why this podcast and having these conversations are so important, is because we get to expose another paradigm and another way to function and be. So we make this transformative generational change, which is the magic behind all of it and the purpose of Empowered Educator in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're 100% right. I mean, I know I feel it in my own body sometimes. The anxiety that comes from, I'm about to do something different from what I was taught. Like, I'm about to take a risk, and I'm about to ask the student to explore something that is not in the learning that I gleaned in college or grad school or whatever it might be. It took me a long time to feel like we can experiment a little bit, not to the degree that like students are at risk, right? Like, it's okay for me to change the paradigm. It's okay for me to change and explore some new way of learning with my students.
Nothing changes if nothing changes.
Exactly.
And you're the variable. Like, you're the one that gets changed, but that's scary. And it's just scary because it's different. And that's, I think, the rub here that's important, that when we bump up against these limitations or boundaries that we've put on ourselves that go out of our comfort zone, there is going to be that element of fear, because that's just our biology keeping us safe and alive, which, great, you're doing a great job. We made it. We're alive. We're here. But it's also preventing us from reaching our dreams, trying something different, becoming our fullest potential, or even just, as you were describing your own journey, having the journey of becoming, right? So in your experience, have you navigated that fear as you've been expansive in your own life and your own work?
To be perfectly transparent, sometimes I'm more successful than others. Right? Like, I'm perfect.
Sure. Yeah. Because you're a human. That's beautiful.
Of course. And at the risk of sounding like a Feldenkrais fanatic, like, honestly, the process that you go through in a Feldenkrais lesson is so helpful to me, because it's exactly this process, right?
Yeah. Walk us through.
In like a group class, you would lie on the floor, and I can still hear my trainer's voice saying, please lie on your back. And like, my whole system like relaxes. And then you go through this series of like, you do a body scan, you pay attention to where you are in space and time. And then you're given this instruction to like, move your arm slowly in a certain direction. And then you're just asked to do these little bits of movement. And the question that I love the most in that process, and that I ask my students in lessons also, is, and what do you notice? Without attachment to it being better or worse. Just what do you notice as you explore this thing? What do you observe in yourself? How does your body change in its contact with the floor? How does gravity interact with your body? Are you breathing? Are you nervous? Can you stay present while you move? And so just those little questions of awareness help me not get attached to the outcome, right? I mean, sure, I want my back to feel better. Of course I do. But because it's not constantly like, if you move your arm to the right, your back pain will get better. That's not the instruction in a Feldenkrais lesson. It's just notice. Just notice what this is. And as the teacher at leading that lesson, I know that eventually we're going to come around, right? And I can imagine some possible outcomes for the lesson. But here's the really humbling thing as an educator, is that almost always there's an outcome that I never would have anticipated. And people have these transformative experiences that there's no way I could have taken aim at and brought them to. But the process of just slowing down, resting, here's another important moment, is like you do 30 movements and then you rest for 30 seconds. And then you do another few movements and then you rest and you notice, right? It's this very meditative, sweet process. That model, sometimes I put myself on the floor so I remember how to do it. But that's the process that I take myself through when I don't feel safe. It's like, okay, where am I in space and time? What do I notice? Where do I have ease? And where can I reduce the effort? What can I simplify? And that's just the next step.
Yes to all of that. Now, there's a couple of things there too. First of all, that noticing is something that I talk about a lot. It's like we're just kind of strengthening that notice muscle all the time because you can't actually change something you don't notice.
Sure.
And we walk around not noticing most things.
And our brains are wired for that, right?
Yes.
It's actually how we make sense of the world is to develop patterns and habits so that we don't have to be deciding things all the time. It's too much for us to be having to process all of that constantly. So we create patterning and habits, and sometimes they serve us and sometimes they don't. But the intention is always good. It's always our body trying to keep us safe.
And in that separation of, I am not my nervous system, this is happening, really allows you to then also separate your own worth about it too, because it isn't about your own worthiness or your own value. It's your back hurts because your body's trying to tell you something, and we need to be better listeners at what's happening. And we can only listen when we notice. It's funny because as a former hustler, go, neck upper, as you're describing Feldenkrais, it took me right back to when I was a senior in college taking Carol's class. And me being like, what is this? Doesn't have time. Whatever this crazy crap is, I'm going to just like sit and breathe real little. Like, what is this?
It's true.
And, right. And it wasn't until relatively recently, in the last couple of years, that I have discovered the true value to my own well-being and my own health to get quiet and to notice and making these small movements and doing the breathing and this and that and having permission to relax for a minute.
Yeah.
And so can you talk to that? As someone who is potentially new to meditation, is new to Feldenkrais, how do you even get to a point where you're like, if you're so afraid to just stop because what's going to happen if I stop? The world's going to fall apart if I stop.
I can feel like that for sure. And I would say, you don't have to be perfect at it. If all you can do is stop for 30 seconds, then stop for 30 seconds. It doesn't have to be a half hour. I meditate every single morning. Some days it's 5 minutes, some days it's 20. But what I notice in myself is if I don't do it, then I'm like in this anxiety wheel and I don't feel like myself. I wake up early before my child is awake, before my wife is awake, like it's quiet. And I just take the time to do it. And I think sometimes what gets hidden in there in not wanting to take the time is not wanting to invest in, or maybe I'll say this a different way. So we don't quite believe that we're worth the time.
Yes. Say more.
So I'm reading and listening, and I've read this book many times now, The Body is Not an Apology by Sonia Renee Taylor. And it's all about radical self-love and how that can be transformative and change the world in these amazing ways. But it's such a good reminder for me that taking the time for myself is not only transformative for me, but it's transformative for the people around me. And so that investment in myself helps everybody else. And I need that reminder because I think like a lot of educators and certainly like a lot of women, I take care of a lot of different people. I'm holding space for a lot of different people. I'm supporting my families through all kinds of things, not just their educational process, but things that are coming up in their lives. And as a mentor to kids, especially when you create safe space for them, they tell you a lot of different things, right? So it's a lot to hold. It's a lot to hold. And when I'm in the right space for myself, then I can do it without sacrificing myself. It's not at my expense and I can still show up for them.
Well, that's just it, because you can't hold space if you're not in a place to hold space.
Right.
Unless you start doing some of this work, you don't even know what that feels like yet. There's a whole world that's available to you in a way of being that's available to you that you might not even realize. And this kind of practice is a gateway into understanding how that's possible.
Right. Yeah. And I think that it's also fair to say that sometimes when we stop and pay attention, what we notice is that we're in pain. And that's hard to face. right? It's not like, oh, it's all sunshine and roses every time I meditate, right? Sometimes I show up and I'm like, oh man, I'm really pissed right now. Or like this thing that's happening in my personal life is really painful. And I don't want to sit with that. Like, I don't want to be with that any more than I have to be. But I think for me, what happens when I do sit with it is that I do start to recognize what's me and what's not me. Where do I end and where does the problem begin? And how can I give myself the self-care and love and compassion that I need to then approach the problem and solve the problem, again, without sacrificing myself instead of just reacting, I guess.
Right. Because you actually can't do that unless you're centered and calm and your nervous system is safe. You aren't able to solve problems in a way that's helpful necessarily if you're activated. And sometimes we don't even realize we're activated because it's just, again, in the air we breathe. Especially since the pandemic, people wake up and are activated. Yes, they're activated in their sleep because they can't sleep or they're having all these stress dreams. Right. You can't find that quiet unless you create that for yourself. And like you said before, I want to reiterate it, you are worthy of that quiet, because one of the most fundamental principles of the work that I do is the most generous thing you can do for other people is take care of yourself.
Yeah.
Which is a radical idea in a lot of spaces that I go into, because as educators, and like you said, also as women, we tend to take on everyone else's stuff, but that leaves us feeling depleted and consistently pouring from an empty vessel, and it's not sustainable.
Oh, for sure. And I think with my family background, the message that I got in this kind of toxic environment that I was growing up in was everybody else's comfort is more important than your own. And so do sacrifice yourself as much as you possibly can so that everybody else is happy, so that you're putting out the landmines so that nobody has to yell and everybody can stay safe. But what that meant for me is that I did take it all on. And it was so painful that it was hard for me to figure out whether it was worth living another day. And so raising my own child, my daughter's 9, it is so important for me that she gets this message that you are the most important one to take care of, right? You're not responsible for anybody else's feelings. You're not responsible for taking care of whatever difficulty they're having. Your responsibility is to yourself. And then everybody else will also be taken care of. But do not sacrifice yourself for everybody else. I mean, I don't know how much more painful it can get when kids are suicidal and self-harming, and it's got to change.
Imagine that was the message. It wasn't math class. It's not science class. It's not a community class. We're here to teach you how to be a human being, because we are on that journey also as your teachers. Yes. And we're going to do that today through math, through science, because if we're not doing that, we are perpetuating these problems and we're not looking at them in a way that's helpful. And is it confronting? Yes. Does it always feel good? No. But I think at the end of the day, we're not healing our wounds and growing and expanding as human beings. And then what are we doing? What does math mean if we're not able to be whole? What does music mean? What does art mean if we're not able to connect with that part of our humanness, which is often why I get so frustrated with these social emotional programs like we spoke about before we were recording. It's like, you can't teach Spanish if you don't have conversational Spanish skills. We can't teach social emotional skills unless we ourselves as the adults are able to embody them, not just speak the words of empathy and community and kindness. It's actually self-love, putting yourself first and knowing that is truly the most generous thing you can do for the people around you.
Yeah. And we're not going to be good at it sometimes.
Yeah, that's right.
Right. Because I can go to that place where I can get perfectionistic about not being perfectionistic. It's so bad.
Talk about a feedback loop there.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. It's okay, well, I really have to hold space. So am I doing a good job being a good human? And it's no, just being able to say sometimes, I'm sorry, I just made a mistake.
Yeah.
My bad. No big deal. And I also then can't beat myself up, right? If I'm trying to teach my students not to beat themselves up because they've made mistakes, it means that I can't indulge myself in beating myself up when I've made a mistake. But the beautiful thing is that then it gets modeled for my students, right? Who then are oh, Sharon just made a mistake. And look, she's fine. We're moving on. And maybe she doesn't have the answer, but she's going to find it, or like, however it gets handled, it gets handled. Yeah. And then sometimes I get afraid that then the conversation amongst my students or their parents is going to be like, oh, Sharon doesn't really know what she's talking about.
Isn't that interesting? And so, right. And that's like just some of that old programming, right? Because even that indulging isn't you, it's your old programming of beating yourself up about not being a perfectionist, and even separating that, like you yourself as this spiritual being having this human experience from like your biology is really important in this process too. And, what I love talking about, when you get into that kind of space, it's that spiritualness of us as humans. That is in the neuroscience research. Like, it's really important here because when I talk about some of the stuff, it can get high on the woo scale.
Same.
And not all of my listeners are like super high on the woo scale. So it's also super, which is cool. Like, to each his own. But I also want to just ground it in like, this is actual science. This is about how our brains work and the function of what we are as human beings, and being able to even just have some levity about it, right? I think when people work with me too, they think I go around singing Kumbaya with my kids, but like, I slept with my kids this morning. Like it happens because we're human. But again, it's making that conscious decision, like, okay, I'm human. I made a mistake. Apologize for the things, acknowledging to my children that I am also human. I make mistakes too. And it's learning for everybody because how we show up is how we model for the people around us.
Yeah, for sure. I'm a big neuroscience geek because again, like Feldenkrais can feel really woo-woo. And what we're learning, because there's a lot we don't know about the brain. Like there's so much that we don't know about the brain. But as we're learning more and more, especially recently, the science is really showing us that, there's a lot of conversation happening in these different parts of the brain that like signals are firing and triggering from one to the next and to the next. And so mind body is actually a thing, right? It actually happens in their brain. We're not a mind or a body or a spiritual being or an emotional being. Like we are all of it all the time.
Yeah.
And all of those different parts of the brain trigger other parts, and they're all in concert with one another at all times. Right. And so I know that there's many educators listening who are not musicians, but I can go a long way with music metaphors, right? That when you have an ensemble of people and you have all these different parts of your brain and everyone is working together to create beautiful music, sometimes when there's that one little thing that just gets off, then everything else, it changes the entire experience. Yeah. But if we can just stop and hold space for this one little thing that needs to just kind of align with everything else, then beautiful things happen that like bring us to tears, right?
Yes. Oh, and we can totally go down a rabbit hole there. So to be continued. I want to just ask you this last question because it's something I ask everybody, and because I think it's important that we share our dreams out loud. So that's the first step for them becoming reality. What is your dream for the future of education?
Oh, my dream for the future of education is that every child feels safe and seen, and that spaces that they're learning in are safe spaces and also brave spaces where they can be challenged and invigorated and held as whole humans. And educators can also be seen and held and acknowledged as whole humans, and administrators can be seen and held and acknowledged as whole humans. And we'll have compassion for our humanity and more connection and less pain.
Yes, more of that. So how can people work with you, get in touch with you? What's new? What's coming up next?
Yeah, so I'm in the process of developing an online course. And one of the things that's going to be coming up soon is a very exclusive opportunity to work with me live via Zoom. Before the course goes on autopilot, there will be an opportunity coming up to be able to do some of this work. It's grounded in Feldenkrais and coupled with self-awareness. So it's doing gentle movement, helping your body feel better, and also really thinking deeply about who you are as a human and what superpowers you get from just who you are. So there is a link that I'll share with you where people can get a brief, short example of what that might be like, a little Feldenkrais lesson. It's 10 minutes when they sign up for my email list, and then they'll be on the list and can learn about how to engage in that exclusive class once it launches.
Amazing. And all of that will be put in the podcast notes too. So it'll be super easy for people to access. I am excited for you. I'm excited for just where this is going in your new venture with this. This stuff really is important and needs to be shared. So I encourage folks who are listening, go ahead and check out Sharon's stuff because it is juicy.
Thank you.
Great.
Oh, yeah, I'm excited.
Yes. Thank you so much for spending your morning with me. I so appreciate you and this beautiful conversation we had. And I'm looking forward to hopefully connecting and doing some more of this great conversation.
Yeah, I would love that. And thank you so much for all of the work that you're doing in the world. I think it's huge and it's needed. So deeply appreciative of you.
Thank you, everyone, for listening. And if you liked today's episode, go ahead and write a great review. And we will see you next time on Take Notes. Incredible, right? Together, we can revolutionize the face of education. It's all possible, and it's all here for you right now. Let's keep the conversation going at Empowered Educator Faculty Room on Facebook.